and metapopulation dynamics that it chooses. So for example, whether you settle in a kin-structured neighborhood has effects on population persistence, and whether or not you're able to move from one population to another has the opportunity for demographic rescue, which influences metapopulation dynamics. And ultimately, these things all influence evolutionary dynamics, because when a bird does move from population to another population, it induces gene flow, which can have the effect of genetic rescue and can shape the evolutionary trajectory of individual species, such as isolation barriers to movement. So all of that is very interesting. And we have been working on the dispersal ecology for jays for nearly the entire 50-year duration of the study. So this is a graph showing the mean dispersal distances of males and females, showing that most dispersals are very short, but that females go a little farther. I think this first analysis appeared in the late 1970s. Our most recent analysis is in a paper from 2020. And this pattern has been robust, holding up at all different stages of the analysis from the Jay project. And so that's a strong pattern that's derived simply from market capture of banded birds in our study area. There are also different scale of movements that we have done in the past, again, relating to dispersal, that is derived from genetics. So this is work that Aurélie Coulon and the rest of us did at a statewide level. And this is looking at genetic variation. And so a couple things to point out. You can see here is a genetic unit, but there's enough genetic homogeneity within this that it links these metapopulations, suggesting that there is movement among these metapopulations. And occasionally we see individuals with a different genetic signature, which suggests that there's movements even to different genetic units. So this is broadening out at a much, much larger scale. But the Florida scrub jay, I'm going to give just some very brief natural history. Almost everybody knows, but it leads up to our next series of questions about the movement of jays. It's a cooperative breeder. So the young remain at home for 1 to 2 years before they become breeders. And when they do become a breeder, most of those movements are short. Those dispersals are within just 1 or 2 territories of their home. But the jays maintain year-round territories, and they're very territorial. And so because of that, we know that the young make these periodic exploratory forays away from their home territory, usually in search of these breeding opportunities. But we don't know much about those exploratory forays. We know the jay is also very habitat and fire specific, yet it moves through a mosaic of patches. So how does that habitat and fire specificity affect its movement patterns? And all of these, we can sort of broaden this into the idea of movement ecology rather than just strictly dispersal ecology. What are the movements of Florida scrub jays at a local scale? So if we think about it as a local scale, let's imagine a bird who's at the territory Jan, and it's surrounded by a bunch of other territories. And we know that these birds have frequent territorial interactions. So we should expect to see this bird in all those territories around it, even if it's not exploratory movement, even if it's just simply territory defense. And you can also see the habitat mosaic of different types of habitat patch and how might those habitats influence where a bird moves. But now this line is 2 territories out, and this is typically where the birds settle. So movements here might be more exploratory, settling close to home. There's an advantage, a fitness advantage to that. However, the birds might decide to go much farther. And this is those same circles at the scale of the entire demo track. So does the scale of exploratory forays match those of the dispersals? Are they mostly short, or do they go much longer distances? And when they go long distances, do those birds interact with other birds? Is there a social component to those forays? And how do individuals vary in their exploratory behavior? And ultimately, does this variation affect fitness? So in the absence of a technology that we could track all these birds simultaneously over time, about 5 years ago, we developed an observational method to get at this. So this is the study area, and each one of these circles is a point count. And we established point counts that we visited 2 or 3 times a week, where we played territorial calls at those sampling points, and then recorded all the ID of all the birds that responded. So if a bird was wandering away from its territory, heard these calls and was attracted to it, we would catch birds that were on these exploratory forays. And we recorded all these forays for 5 years, as well as incidental observations of birds when they were away from their territory. Now we can also overlay all those observations on our territory maps, habitat time since fire maps, and characterize why birds are going. But remember, this is a solution to the lack of technology 5 years ago. So one example is work by our graduate student, David Scher, who's finished his master's thesis. So on the right, you see a map of territories and the locations we saw. So here's a bird from the blue territory. It was seen at all these locations. We overlaid those locations where it was seen on time since fire maps to be able to look at where was it seen relative to the availability of those maps. And we just sampled these 4 birds, although we did about 30 birds. And so this just shows that all these birds showed a preference for optimal habitat. However, 2 of them showed preference for either early burned, recently burned habitat, and 1 for overgrown habitat, which suggests there's some individual variation in these habitat preferences during these exploratory forays. Angela also worked hard to look at who birds were interacting with. And so again, if birds were seen at the same point, we assume they were aggregating together. And from that, she's developed a social network that shows who all individual birds interact with, and the width of the line is how often they interact with those birds. And you can see that some birds, like all these birds over on the right, are up on Red Hill, so that geographic isolation results in social isolation. But we can also narrow in on a small network and look at 2 specific birds who are linking all of these birds to birds in these other networks. And so the bird's position in a social network can vary quite a bit. And Angela's already published a paper on how life history stage can explain the behavior of a social network. But these still are aggregation points that are just instantaneous snapshots. It's a small sample limited by space and time. We don't know what other birds were doing while we were at a particular aggregation point. What we really want is this map, which all of you I'm sure are familiar with. It's not taken from a Florida scrub jay, that shows a pathway, the actual path that an individual moved while it was moving, and what habitats it might have used, in this case, whether it was on public lands or private lands. However, those were done by a bear. And if you look at the size of the collar on that bear, there's no way you can imagine putting that on a Florida scrub jay. So GPS technology had not been miniaturized enough to be able to put it on a small passerine until CTT. The technology that we'd hoped for had arrived. A company named Cellular Tracking Technology in 2018, introduced what they call the life tag system. These were lightweight, solar-powered tags that use cellular technology. You could put an infinite number of tags out because they didn't each have an individual frequency. They all shared the same frequency. And they created a signal that was received by multiple nodes, which for an analogist are like cell towers, and a precise location could be used under trilateration, which is the same technology that you can locate a GPS signal. Locations, these things beep every 2 seconds, and locations can be determined every 2 minutes to every 10 minutes. It's however you decide to scale it. And the raw data are actually have to be coded, run through coded filters to get these locations, but we can do that in R, and that makes it a little bit simpler. So basically, here's the technology. You put a life tag on a jay, that life tag is beeping, and those beeps are detected by these nodes. Think of those nodes as cell phone towers. These nodes have a limited storing capacity, so about every 20 minutes, they transmit all their data, the raw data, to a sensor station. And then that sensor station ultimately uploads those data to the cloud, where we can run it through filter algorithms and get our location data. So it all sounds relatively simple. We're discovering it's anything but simple, but powerful. So in order to prove our concept, what we wanted to first do is install a pilot version of the tracking system, test signal strength and accuracy, and also monitor the tag durability and the effect on jay behavior. And I'm going to go over some of what we've done. So our initial pilot project was a grid of 42 nodes. Our sensor station was put at the water tower, and so the longest distance between the node and the water tower was 2.33 kilometers, 1.18 kilometers to the closest node. The nodes you can see here in this arrow are just these little boxes with an antenna, a solar cell on top. We put on 10-foot conduit, and as I said, we're put in a 200 meter by 200 meter grid. As I said, the water tower was where we put the antenna with the base station at the end, and we could receive signals from all the nodes in the grid. This is Young, and Mike Lanzone is the CEO of CTT, installing that up on the water tower. And just for those people who think I'm afraid to go up to the water tower, I took the picture. These are jays with tags on, so you can see the tag is very lightweight. It's put on with a hip harness. It has a solar cell on the receiver, which we extend down below the feather so it can maintain constant power during daylight hours. It's less than 1% of the body mass of the jays and doesn't have any effect on the behavior of the jays. And this is just an example of 2 weeks of data using 10-minute averages for 6 different birds. So the most important thing is to see the volume of location data, a tremendous amount of data in a 2-week period. However, we wanted to do some experiments on accuracy. So we put out some tags on the ground at 1.5 meters and at 3 meters. Some tags were moving because they were on a little rotating pedestal. And we varied vegetation density and vegetation height to look at the actual distance of tags to the nodes and how these different factors influence the error that we got in the spatial polygons. So here's an example of some different polygons. You can see the polygons are relatively large, varying by 100 to 150 meters. What's interesting is that they actually got larger as the tags were higher. And that's actually, ultimately we figured that out. That seemed counterintuitive, but ultimately figured out is because when you're higher up, more nodes are receiving you. And you'll understand in a bit why that leads to greater error rather than less. And so these are just some bar charts of our error. So you can see the distance from centroid goes up with height. It also varies by node a little bit, and we still have yet to resolve why some nodes give us different factors. It does vary by vegetation height, but again, somewhat counterintuitively, we get, no, that actually is consistent. We get shorter distances with taller vegetation. And again, that's because they're actually higher. And there's no significant difference in density. So just some very summary things. We're getting over 1,000 points, location points per tag per week. Most prospecting movements are in the afternoon. 50% of our movements are all outside of the territory, and females are outside of the territory more often than males. So that's a huge proportion of the time that these young birds are spending outside of their territory. And the extraterritorial movements range from just little short things to over 1.2 kilometers. So they're going both short and long distances. Finally, Angela again applied our CTT data to a social network, and I won't go into it in detail. We have an R code that will look for associations of birds in the same place at the same time. And the main point is the network derived from the CTT made perfect sense based on our knowledge from our social networks on the observation grid. So it seems to make perfect sense. All of that is really encouraging. We can also calculate how the signal strength of the tag as the node is receiving it relates to the distance. And this is a curve that is sort of expected. You can see that beyond signal strength actually is going down as you go right in this. So these are weak signals over here. And you can see we get a lot more variation and a less accurate relationship to distance as signal strength weakens. We can visualize that more like that. So our optimal signal strength is an RSSI, the signal strength of less than 96 or greater than minus 96. And our optimal grid size is actually somewhere around 400. So our pilot grid was a little smaller than we needed, although it's very accurate. However, that also adds a lot of cost. So we experimented with a 400-meter grid. And so if here's a 400-meter grid, and here were just some random bird locations, the distance to the node, you always get at least 3 nodes that have less than 400 meter, and usually 4 nodes that have less than 400 meters, depending on where a bird is. 4 nodes receiving signals less than 400 meters would be relatively high strength. That should give us fairly accurate locations. So this year we went to a full grid over the entire demo track, but this is a 400-meter grid. We added 5 sensor stations to make sure all nodes could communicate with a sensor station. And we tagged a large proportion of the 2020 cohort. So we are now in the selection where we're actually collecting data on individual birds, all within a cohort through real time. And this will give us some estimation of how much variation there is in exploratory movements among birds. So I'm going to just briefly go through some of the issues. Data storage and data management is a huge thing. You can see how much data we get. We need servers for storage. Those data are originally stored in the cloud, so we need good techniques for downloading and converting raw data to location data. Fortunately, this can be done in R, and there is a GitHub server, which is an online sort of community that shares R code. So, for example, Angela got the code for the social network stuff from the R package GitHub. So that's great for collaborations across. We don't have to write all our own code necessarily. However, another problem is that we have multiple sensor stations. Some nodes are reporting to multiple sensor stations, therefore we have replicate data in our data set, which we need to figure out a way to code out. We also have had a lot of tag issues. So we lost quite a lot of tags on birds. Initially, some of it was with our harnessing technique. Subsequent loss has all been quality control issues from the company dealing with the tab that we put on the birds to move that tag down the body so the solar cell can be visible. We still haven't completely worked those out with the company, but we've been able to find lost tags. So each of these pictures has a tag as it was shed from the bird. And fortunately, Young is really great at finding those. And there they all are. So that's been able to give us some insight into how the tags are being lost and how we can fix them. We have some issues with the nodes, but all of these are relatively straightforward to fix. You can see we've gotten some opaque residue as a result of being out in the sun, but that doesn't actually seem to affect battery strength. But we do need to regularly maintain these things. So there's a lot of maintenance work necessary to maintain this grid in functional order, both tags, nodes, and sensor stations. So I'm going to bring you back to this image. And we talked about the optimal signal strength and the optimal grid size and why we were getting such big location errors. And part of the problem is we're actually getting much better performance. We're getting more nodes detecting signals than we thought. So nodes that sometimes are 600-800 meters away are still detecting those signals. And they all have signals over in this edge of the range. So our newest approach is to filter those signals out, only include the signals that have the strongest signal strength to get much greater location. And we've gotten some of those results already from CTT. I haven't had time to plot them in a grid, but our location polygons have greatly reduced in size. And so we think there's a few other things, such as developing a different RSI signal filter for different habitat types. So if it's dominated by tall, we might adjust and filter a slightly different RSSI feed. So we can make this signal specific and habitat specific to generate really high quality locations. So assuming that we get to that point, there are so many more data we can address with this. So for example, simple questions like what was the frequency at which they explore, the duration at which they explore, the actual path that they take, and whether or not they're selecting habitat patches or time since fire patches were very difficult to do with any of our previous methods. We can get all those data and we can see how they differ by individual birds. The other questions are much more sort of evolutionary, which is, are there exploratory strategies? I mean, is every bird just doing their own thing? Or do some birds do one thing while other birds do something else? And are those differences in individual movement behavior linked to other different behaviors? So for example, we've been measuring whether birds are bold or shy. Do bold birds have a different exploratory strategy than shy birds? And if those exploratory strategies are related to behaviors, do they then also influence recruitment and fitness? And that leads to the ultimate question, which is, could exploratory behaviors actually be under natural selection? Could they vary among individuals who've been selected for different behavioral traits to adapt to the mosaic of our different habitats? Or are they just completely plastic and merely context specific? You have one strategy if you're surrounded by overgrown habitat, you have a different strategy if you've got a ton of neighbors or you're in recently burned habitat. Those could just be context specific. We can get into all of those by analyzing the pathways of individual birds as they move across the landscape. How do the fires and habitat mosaics affect movement patterns? Again, we can look at those preferences and avoidance. And that's really critical because we want to understand how our management actually affects movement patterns and recruitment and settling patterns. So for years, we've known that part of the reason birds in overgrown habitat die out is because few birds are willing to immigrate into those areas and replace those birds. Does that mean that patches that are surrounded by overgrown habitat are much less likely to be explored by birds than patches that are embedded in low or optimal or recently burned habitat? And then the other thing is, we can actually begin to look at the costs of movements. We never know if a bird dies during dispersal because it simply just disappears. We don't even know it was dispersing. But we can actually develop our code that will alert us when a bird hasn't moved over a certain period of time. And that might serve as a mortality alert. We might know when a bird has died and where it was when it last died. So are birds moving through the landscape more likely to die than birds that are on their natal territory? And if birds have different exploratory strategies, does that subject them to different mortality patterns? And again, this relates not only to fitness, clearly, but whether or not these things might be under natural selection. And then the last big question is, can we take these local movements and scale up? If we know that certain habitat types facilitate exploratory movement at the local level, does that mean that those habitat types in between two populations might be more likely to serve as corridors and facilitate movements across a metapopulation. So again, these aren't just necessarily local movements, but these have the potential to give us great, great insights. And there's so many other questions. So in conclusion, this can be a really effective system. You have to do a fair bit of troubleshooting, and it requires lots of ongoing continuous maintenance. So we're going to need to scale the lab up with at least one full-time person, really just to maintain this grid. And you can see that's a bird with the tag on. You can see the antenna going down its back. It includes a lot of complex algorithms that are done in Python or R, and that's complex. We need new algorithms every time we add new questions, new users. You have to get the data from the cloud. This is all very expensive and requires some high level of computational. And Viv and her group have stepped forward and are trying to really bring their expertise to solving this question so it becomes a great tool for Archbold Biological Station, not just the bird lab. We do need to consider potential impacts for birds. So we have to do a lot of monitoring of the jays just to make sure that we're not having any impact on their fitness just because the birds carry a tag. But it can be adapted to so many species. Betsy's already putting these on gopher tortoises. The tags are super small. They can be put on all sorts of organisms. And because the code is, the raw data are always there, new code can be developed to address new questions in movement ecology. So I want to thank everybody, especially Young Ha Suh is doing her PhD using these data. And everybody has been a tremendous collaborative team. It's exciting to work at the leading edge of this new technology and working closely with the folks from Cellular Tracking Technology, including all the hopes. Bert helped us put sensor stations up, and Amartya is very happy to go up on the tower, even as I'm reluctant. So he's been a big help. And I just want to thank everybody. And with that, questions.
Thank you very much, Reed. I should have mentioned prior to Reed starting, if you have any questions, please put them into the Q&A and also include who they're addressed to, just in case we start another presentation and we didn't get your question answered. With that, we do have a question for you, Reed, from Scott Ward. Do you know if CTT is primarily used for biological studies? I'm curious if this technology was tailored for ecological studies.
I do know that it was specifically birds, because Mike Lanzone is a bird guy, he developed it, but its applications can be to anything. And how you array the nodes, the base stations, you can just do presence absence. You don't have to do locational data. So the whole system is very flexible and adaptable and can be, I absolutely see it being applied ecologically. For example, we might be able to put tags on acorns and see where they end up going.
Oh, great. So I really like the acorn, tracking acorns and see where they end up.